This is an immense honor, and it is actually the greatest professional honor I've ever received. But it also makes me a tad uncomfortable as I've thought about it over the last few months, because in many ways, my job was pretty easy. Payne risked her life to get the story. The most I risked was a writer's cramp. And so in some ways, I hope you permit me to think of this as an award that celebrates my book, but in a way also celebrates Ethel Payne and recognizes her significance. And to that end, I also want to bring up the fact that we lost Gwen Ethel. I'm confused with the days, yesterday or the day before. I'm sorry, I've been traveling. And yes, you can recognize from the follically challenged head in the front, that's when I was interviewed by her. And there are these connections in the media that exist today. We each stand on the shoulders of others. And Gwen Ethel has had this extraordinarily distinguished career, but one of the things I think she shared with Payne was a belief in the power of the word, the power of journalism, the power that one of the great powers of journalism is simply to light the dark recesses of society. You don't need to have people on television yelling at each other. That's not the point. Journalism's repertorial strengths is what can change society, and that's in many ways Ethel Payne's story. So let me tell you Ethel Payne's story in the limited time we have together. I want to begin with telling you about her in 1954 in February. Date is obviously significant because in 3 months the Warren Court is going to hand down the Brown v. Board decision. But in February 1954, Ethel Payne is making her way across Washington, D.C. to this building, which we now know as the old Executive Office Building adjacent to the White House. And in this building every week, this fellow, Dwight D. Eisenhower, not with his arms upraised, this is his inauguration, was holding a press conference. He held press conferences quite regularly for reporters. Now, Republicans were ecstatic at this moment because they had not held the White House since 1932. So they were in a position of enormous joy, and they had been holding Lincoln Day dinners. Lincoln, of course, being important to Republicans because he founded the Republican Party. So they had dinner parties and events like this one in Washington, D.C. And for the one in Washington, D.C., they invited 3 different choirs to come and perform for the evening, 2 of which were from white Southern colleges, and the third group was the choir from Howard University in Washington, D.C. The choir from Howard University's bus arrived at Uline Auditorium and for some reason could not get admitted. The police kept telling them to go around the corner. The security guards said, we don't particularly need to have you come in here. In short, anyone in Washington knew what was going on. This is a deeply segregated city, and they were not going to let black performers come into a Republican gathering to honor the president. So Ethel Payne was going to show up at a meeting like this, angry, ticked off, in the parlance of kids today, pissed off at what had happened, and she was going to take it up with the President of the United States. And you who know history are saying to yourself, wait a second, what is a black person going to get to do that in an all-white press corps like this, not to mention that she's female? Where does she get the right to get in there? Well, the story is that at this point in her life, she was the Washington correspondent for the Chicago Defender, the paper you see here at the center. The Chicago Defender was operated in complete invisibility to 85% of Americans. It was a black newspaper, part of a storied history of black newspapers going way back to the 1820s with Freedom Journal, and papers in all cities, including here, the Tri-State Defender existed. And these newspapers functioned and were critically important, but like many African-American institutions, existed in complete invisibility to the white community. They were so important that one journalist, black journalist, described it as being our internet, is how he put it. And Ethel Payne grew up in Chicago, where the Chicago Defender was published. Now, the Chicago Defender, which started in 1905, was not merely a Chicago paper in describing the New York Times merely as a New York paper. This was a newspaper of immense national significance. And you've probably heard the stories of how it got distributed in the South. But briefly, one of the ways it got down here was an alliance with the Pullman Porters. And if you've ever seen a railroad map of the United States, you know it looks like a spider web, and at the center of the web is Chicago. So these Pullman Porters would take bundles of the Defender with them on their runs. And keep in mind, in many communities in the South, not only was it against the law to get a copy of the Defender, you could also have extra legal measures taken against you. So it isn't just a matter of wanting to be law-abiding. You could lose your house, you could have violence done against you for just having this paper. So these Pullman Porters would bring the paper down with them and drop them off in towns, and they're in the barber shops on Saturdays when men would come in to get their shave, they would get a copy of the Defender. And the Defender, as I'm sure you all know if you've read Isabel Wilkinson's book, The Warmth of the Suns, was one of the key reasons triggering the mass migration to the north of Chicago. And Ethel Payne was the product of two people who had moved to Chicago in those circumstances. So the Chicago Defender is not just a Chicago paper. It's a paper of enormous influence, enormous importance in the African American community. And that was the world in which Ethel Payne was born. This is her shortly after 1911 when she's born. I love the picture because I know the story behind it. Her parents entered her into a cute baby contest. She came in third and brought home a pound of chocolate. Here she is in Englewood, that's her brother, and that's the house which still stands today, and there's now a movement in Englewood to try to put up at least a plaque about the house. It was unusual. They owned it because her father was a Pullman Porter, and one of the two best paying jobs for an African American male in Chicago at the time. So they actually owned their home. He died when he was very young and she was very young, and the mother kept the ship together, so to speak, during the Depression. But she had a very unusual situation, and I'm assuming a lot of you understand the topography of South Side Chicago. She was in a part of South Side Chicago, which is West Englewood, was not like the rest of South Side Chicago. She described it as being an island of blackness surrounded by a sea of whiteness, in that every which way she walked out of the neighborhood, she walked into a white neighborhood. This was important because segregation in Chicago, of course, was not done by law. It was done by custom, by economic pressure, all kinds of things. But by living there, she was able to avail herself of white facilities. Every Saturday, they'd go to the white library and come home with boxes of books. She went to a white elementary school, and most importantly, she went not just to a white high school, she went to the best high school in the Chicago system that was in existence then, a brand new school called Lindblom. And when I started this research, you in the journalism department will know exactly my reaction. I heard a story that Ethel Payne's English teacher at Lindblom had been Hemingway's English teacher. Now, when I had my first journalism job, my editor told me what every journalist has been told for years, to be skeptical. If your mother says she loves you, check it out. Yeah, I knew this audience would work just for, I said that to the high school kids this morning, and I didn't quite get it. What's he saying about my mother? Anyway, so I looked into it. Turns out that yes, indeed, her English teacher had been Hemingway's English teacher. But what I learned in the role of a biographer, it wasn't as much the influence that she had on Ethel Payne. The significance of it was that she had left Oak Park, the suburbs, to come and teach at Lindblom meant that this must be one of the best white schools in town for her to go there. So I was able to establish the caliber of the school. The other thing that I discovered about Ethel Payne's experience doing this, which is different than other South Side kids, is by walking every day to Lindblom, which meant that she endured taunts and stones and other crap that the white kids threw at her, and being one of just 3 or 4 black kids in her class, is that she learned early how to operate in a majority culture, something that would serve her immensely well as a journalist later. She didn't know what her career path was, but she learned early on the double standards that were going to be applied to her. The high school paper, glad to have you submit your stories, we'll publish them, but you're not going to be on the staff. We're not going to put your name on the staff. You're a black woman. You'll be glad to know that Lindblom now, they had me come and give a speech, and it was in coincidence with renaming the journalism part of the building the Ethel Payne Journalism Center. So kids going in there with their smartphones will Google her name and say, that woman came out of my neighborhood, so can I. That's the kind of heritage I hope Ethel Payne will have. So she graduated from Lindblom High School, that's her picture then, and she faced, you'll wonder why I have her in a military uniform, she faced the obstacle that any ambitious woman in the 1930s and 40s faced. She faced the same obstacles any ambitious African American faced in Chicago at that time. She faced the obstacles that any African American woman faced at that time. A professional black woman in Chicago was as rare as a warm day in the windy winters of that city. 7 out of 10 black women who held jobs when she went out looking for a professional job in Chicago worked as domestic employees. The idea that she could find a career that involved writing, a career that might involve law, was so out of the question. But because of her mother, because of the importance of books in her household, because of her drive, she never let the doors that slammed in her face stop her from keeping trying. So she worked as a corrections worker, she worked in a daycare center, she worked for the Chicago library system, but nothing was working. She got active with the NAACP. She worked on the original March on Washington, we're talking about 1941, with A. Philip Randolph. And when she was organizing in Chicago, she had the temerity to say to him, look, I don't want to be in your typing pool. I want a position of leadership. She got him on the phone. This is a woman with enormous nerves. She wrote to W.E. Du Bois a letter when she was just out of school and said, I want to write your biography, sir. I know it takes research skills, I know it takes this, and I know it takes a lot of nerve. I don't know about the other things, but I've certainly got a lot of nerve. We don't know if he answered her. But it was a really revealing remark about herself. She had guts to keep having these doors closed on her. So in 1948, she spotted an ad in the paper that in occupied Japan, they were looking for service club hostesses. These were people that would run what we now call USO clubs in occupied areas in Germany and Japan. So she answered the ad, got the job. There she is on ship trying to get her sea legs. She had brought saltines with her. And she ended up working in Japan. Now, this is in 1948, and I know the historians among you are saying, wait a second, Truman has signed the order desegregating troops. Why would they be service clubs just for African Americans and just for whites? The reason is a fellow named General MacArthur. He refused to listen to anything Truman said. In fact, as you all know, that's one of the reasons he ended up getting canned in the end. But he kept the troops segregated in Japan, and as you will know, in the Korean War. So you'll see in these photographs, she is tending the needs of young African-American men. Keep in mind, most of these are kids, 18, 19, 20-year-olds serving in occupied Japan, very far from home. One of the things I discovered is that the segregation was porous. I found a lot of white soldiers got permissions from their COs to be able to go to her club because the music was better, the food was better, but no one went the other way. Ethel Payne also got interested in Japan. This is occupied Japan, a decimated country. It's not just the atomic bomb that had wrecked. Remember the fire bombs, everything was wrecked. A whole generation of young men were gone. And so there was a large population of destitute women in Japan without company and without means. And think what was there. Hundreds of thousands of young American males with money in their pocket. They're all in the military running around Japan. As a result, new relationships formed. And you can see a private look at Japanese occupation, baby-san, because as a result of these matches, a lot of babies were born out of wedlock. This was a somewhat, and I'm using the term, somewhat of a problematic situation for the military, but trust me, it became much more problematic when African-American men hooked up with Japanese women. These mixed-race babies were shunned to such an extent that they were often killed, left, abandoned, and ended up in orphanages. It was also an extraordinarily challenging problem for the military because if you think this through, the military officers were mostly Southern whites, for whom back home the idea of a black man just even looking at a white woman could be a problem. Imagine having men under your command now living with Japanese women and producing these babies. So this was a story they did not want the world to know. The Korean War got underway, and because the troops were still segregated, Alex Wilson and another reporter, James Hicks from the Baltimore African American, came to Tokyo to cover the Korean War. You had to go through Tokyo to get to the Korean War. And because the troops were segregated, this was a big story if you were from a black member of the black press in the United States. Because one of the things that was happening is that MacArthur could not relieve the black troops as quickly as he could relieve the white troops because he wasn't going to send in a white soldier to take a black soldier's place. And if you remember the Korean War, it did not go well at the beginning. So a lot of African American soldiers moved back from the front line rather than be slaughtered needlessly because of a racial policy. They were being put into trials, court-martials at an extraordinarily higher rate than whites, court-martials facing possible execution for having left the front line. A young lawyer named Thurgood Marshall came to Japan to defend these men, and he did successfully, and he helped Ethel Payne, and I'll tell you how it helped her. So these reporters I told you arrived in Japan. They met Ethel Payne, and she began to tell them about these children that had been born. And they said, well, what material do you have on it? She had no place to publish her story. She'd been publishing it in her diary, basically, keeping copious notes on that. Alex Wilson said, may I have permission to publish your diary? He took it back to Chicago. First byline of Ethel Payne, by Ethel Payne, Director, Army Service Club, says, Japanese girls playing GIs for suckers, says fate that awaits war babies is tragedy of Yank Oriental unions. This is a huge story in Chicago for a couple reasons. One, think about it. If you're a woman and your sweetie or your husband's in Japan, you're thinking, what the heck's going on over there? So from just that point of view, around the coffee clutches in the morning, everybody would be talking about it. But secondly, the travesty, the injustice given to these poor kids. Jet magazine, heartbroken Negro Jap orphans shedding tears because full-blooded Japanese youngsters in Piso, Japan, teased them with cries of half-breed Americans. This is not a story the military wanted out. MacArthur's office immediately yanked Ethel Payne from her job, put her in a dead-end job, and she was going to be fired dishonorably. And that's when, as I was mentioning, Thurgood Marshall arrived. He worked out an arrangement with MacArthur to get him off. I got 30 seconds to tell you the story. This isn't an end note in my book. It's one of these things as a writer, you sometimes run across great stories, but you say, I can't put it in, it takes it away, but you can save it for a moment like this. Thurgood Marshall had these arguments with MacArthur all the time about why is there not more black snipers? And MacArthur said they can't shoot straight. And he said, wait a second, the one who's killed more people than anybody else is an African-American sniper. Well, maybe. So they had these, these kind of tit-for-tat arguments. And then MacArthur said, quiet down, the band is coming into play. So the band marched in front of him, and they played very well, of course, all white. And Thurgood Marshall leaned over him and said, now, come on, Mr. General, you can't tell me you can't find a Negro who can't blow a trumpet like these guys can. And that was the end of the argument. That's in the endnotes. It's in Marshall's diary. The point is that he used his influence to save Ethel Payne, but the problem was for her, she was coming back to the United States with a job, but the Chicago Defender hired her. Now, it is not an act of charity. Louis Martin, the editor of the Chicago Defender, understood that Ethel Payne had a keen journalistic sense. This is the thing that you can't really always develop, but you either have it or not, is seeing the story, understanding what is the story. And so he decided he could hire her untrained and make her into a journalist. And I think it's very similar to a jazz artist who learns in the band rather than school. She was going to learn on the job, and boy, did she ever. Here she is interviewing Adlai Stevenson, who ran for president in 52 and 56 against Eisenhower, and you folks will get this joke. My high school group did not get it. One of the things they said about Adlai Stevenson was that he was the thinking man's candidate for president, and therein lay the problem. I knew it would work with you folks. Here she is now in Washington. That's Roy Wilkins to the left, Louis Latour, one of the first African Americans admitted to the White House press corps. Ethel Payne had a hard time getting admitted to the press corps because the rules of the White House press corps and others were always written in a manner that excluded groups, but without excluding the group in writing. So they said things like no weekly papers. Well, the Chicago Defender was weekly. It turns out most of the black papers were weekly, so what they were doing is writing rules that prevented. But anyway, she was able to finally win admission and join the White House press corps. You can hear some of Ethel Payne if you really want to hear her voice. If you go to NPR, they did a piece about Ethel Payne based on my book, and you can hear her talking. I'm not going to risk it at this point. So I've told you all this about Ethel Payne, and we were back in February of 1954, and you're thinking, God, this guy takes so long to set the story. So here's the story. She goes into the press conference, angry, filled with rage about what happened to the Howard University choir. Mr. President, she yells from the back. At that point, 200 white male faces turn around and look at her. And as I say all the time, if I had been in her shoes at that moment, I would have hoped I was wearing Depends. Mr. President, the Howard University choir tried to come and sing at the Lincoln Day event, and the bus was banned from coming in. What's up with that? Now, she didn't say what's up with that in the 1950s, but, I don't have the text in front of me. Well, the president didn't become president by accident. He's a wily politician, so he says, gee, if that happened because they are Negro, that would be wrong, but I don't know anything about it. I'll have my staff check into it. And he got out of it. What happened the next day is what changed Ethel Payne's life. because the Washington Post, a paper that prides itself on local coverage, had never written a word about what happened to the Howard University choir. Guess what? Now that it's in a national press conference, they had to cover the story. So did the Los Angeles Times, so did the New York Times. This racial injustice suddenly became a national story. Why? Because Ethel Payne had asked a question at the national press conference with the president. So this became a habit of hers. She began to show up at these press conferences all the time, and she worked with Clarence Mitchell, who was the NAACP lobbyist in Washington, nicknamed the 101st Senator for being effective. So they'd get together and craft these questions. Now keep in mind, she couldn't just ask a question of the president about civil rights. Why? Because he knew nothing. But not only did he know nothing, nor did the white reporters in the room. So her questions had to educate as well as ask the question. So she got attacked by Louis Latour as being really verbose because her questions took several minutes to ask, but she couldn't ask them the way others would. You know, what about section this or what about that, the kinds of inside politics. So this went on for quite a while. She asked a question about this, a question about that, and until one day she had the temerity to ask him a very touchy question. Now, if you want the real words, go to the book or go to NPR, because I'm going to give you the version I can remember. Mr. President, Mr. President! And he looks down and says, yes. Under the Constitution, you have the power, under the Commerce Clause, to ban segregation on interstate bus travel. What are you going to do about it, Mr. President? And he looked down in this kind of pose. This is not the actual moment, but I found a picture when he gets angry. Stiff like a general. And he says to her, I don't know where you get to ask that question. And everybody thinks because I tend to get excited I'm making up the you. Well, trust me, I drove to Abilene, Kansas. I went and listened to the recordings of Eisenhower, and he's got anger in his voice when he says that. So he assaults her for asking the question, but then he goes on to say, I'm trying to do things for all Americans, not just for any special interest. The room went dead silent. What he had said is that the black freedom struggle in the United States was no different than farmers wanting an increase in dairy support or the oil industry wanting some more wells. It's just a special interest. Trust me, every paper in the United States covered the question she'd asked and his answer. The ones with short headlines, you know, reporter irks Ike, you know, that kind of thing. Eisenhower learned his lesson. You don't call on Ethel Payne to ask questions. So that would have put her out of business early on. 2 or 3 years in the White House press corps, and that's the end of it? Well, it just so happens that Rosa Parks sat in the quote-unquote wrong part of the bus in Montgomery, and the Montgomery bus boycott broke out, and she went to Montgomery. Now, keep in mind, she's African American, she's a female, 2 strikes against you going to Montgomery at that point. The 3rd strike, she's a reporter. She's going to tell the world about what's going on. And trust me, folks in Montgomery who are trying to squash the Montgomery bus boycott were not interested in having Ethel Payne in their backyard. Also, this is something people forget. This guy is being identified in the northern press, if mentioned at all, by the initials M.L. King. This guy, they can hardly spell Abernathy's name. So she's getting there just when the story's breaking. And one of her first byline stories from there, she refers to these men as men wearing reverse collars with the Bible in their hand as a new gladiator going into battle. And if you dissect that sentence, you realize Ethel Payne's genius and historical importance. She, at ground level, on the front line, was seeing the dramatic change that was taking place in the civil rights movement, that had gone from people like Frederick Douglass to Du Bois to A. Philip Randolph to the last legal battles with Thurgood Marshall, to shifting the balance to the clergy and ministers who are bringing Gandhian ideas of nonviolence to the fore that would eventually provide the victories. And she saw it from the first day. The white press, the mainstream press, began to scramble and come down there. And so they would gather on the churches where the meetings were held, and they would be leaning up against the wall, you know, with their reporter pads. And when the various leaders got up, Nixon or Abernathy or King got up on the pulpit, they did not say, "Hi, I'm Reverend King." I mean, everybody knew who they were, right? Everybody knew who they were except for the white reporters leaning up against the wall in the back of the church, who then leaned over to the black reporters and say, "Who the hell is that guy? Abernathy? How do you spell that name?" So immediately this alliance was formed between black reporters and white reporters. White reporters had something the black reporters had that couldn't have, they could go and ask questions of the white politicians and get answers. But black reporters were living in the communities, especially since they couldn't find a place to rent a room, and they were plugged in a way that the white reporters weren't. So every day at Dean's Drugstore in Montgomery, they got together, and they shared information. And I just love the idea that white liberals in the North, reading the Boston Globe, Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, the New York Times, reading accounts of Montgomery by reporters that were famous to them, they didn't know how those accounts were already being shaped by the black press, subtly and indistinctively. So she went down there and covered this at enormous risk, but then she also did something interesting. So one of the first things I wanted you to see about her in terms of historical significance, A, she was bringing questions to people in power and learning how much that could change the national agenda. B, she was one of the first on the front line to see things. But 3, she had a fascinating set of insights. These are photographs from Bandung. Bandung held it as a site on which folks from all the countries in the world, and future countries, because these are mostly colonies, decided to hold a meeting in which they did not invite the 2 rulers of the world, the Soviet Union and the United States. Take a look at the headline. Afro-Asian meets first confab of world's darker peoples. Ethel Payne was going to be there. This was a conference of folks from Asia, Africa, all the future countries that are colonies are gathering and holding a meeting on their own without permission from basically the white bosses of the world. It was amazing. She realized early on that the struggle here in the United States wasn't just merely a domestic struggle, it was intertwined with a worldwide struggle for African self-determination, for black freedom and other freedoms around the world. And that's why Bandung became so important to her. Then in 1957, Ghana becomes the first sub-Saharan country to become free. And for Americans, this is going to be a shock because white Americans are going to see black rulers on their television sets. But for African Americans, they're going to see black rulers in a different way. They're going to be excited. So everybody in the civil rights movement shows up. And Eisenhower sends this man, Richard Nixon, to come and represent the United States. And during that time in Ghana, he meets Martin Luther King. Now this photograph, just so your historians don't get upset at me, this photograph is taken later. There's no photograph of the actual meeting in Ghana. But we do know what King said to Nixon, and Ethel Payne was there. You know, if you're so interested in the freedom struggle for blacks, you might consider taking a little drive down to Alabama. You don't have to go all the way to Ghana to see what's going on. And Nixon says, you know, I really don't think I could do that. But you know what? You could come to Washington and have a meeting with me. And King does that. That's where that picture is taken from. And then King subsequently meets Eisenhower. So King's entry into the White House took place through Ghana in an event witnessed by Ethel Payne. The next thing that Ethel Payne does that's so significant is her legislative coverage of the Civil Rights Act. This is a group meeting around the 1957 Civil Rights Act. You have LBJ over here, you have Hubert Humphrey, and you have John F. Kennedy. And as I told the kids at high school today, you open up a high school history textbook, they're seen as the heroes who gave us all this wonderful legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of '64 and Voting Rights Act of '65. Not in '57, mind you. LBJ had no interest in passing a civil rights bill in '57 that had teeth in it. And this fellow to the left was running for president, John F. Kennedy. He did not want to have a perception of being, quote unquote, Negro-friendly when he went out to meet white voters. So he too was gutting this bill. And the one person holding their feet to the fire was Ethel Payne. When they came off the floor, she would ask them, why have you taken out Section B of this act? Why have you taken out Section 8? All of this kinds of stuff. The hero of the moment, and I'm going to see the older folks in this room fall right out of their seats, is this gentleman. Richard Nixon was pushing for the Civil Rights Act of 1957 for 2 reasons. One, he thought black voters might come back to the Republican Party. It had only been 20 years since they'd left. They might well come back if we stand up for civil rights. Remember, politicians are motivated by votes. Of course, the other joy was he could needle the Democrats. He could say to them, what do you mean you're not in favor of civil rights? You know, I thought that was your big cause. So he was having a great time. One more little bit about Nixon and then we'll move on. You remember I told you how Ethel Payne went to Ghana to cover the mission. Going to Africa and a vice presidential or presidential mission was a big deal in the 50s. You didn't have 747s like the kind Harrison Ford flies around in. In fact, one of the planes had to stop in Morocco and I kid you not, have an engine replaced. So going there was a kind of big deal and it wasn't a comfortable deal. So reporters often held reunions a year afterwards. So they decided to have a reunion and Simeon Booker who was a reporter for Jet magazine, who, by the way, is still with us to this day. He said, let's invite the vice president. What a guest that would be. Of course, it would be so funny. We got the invitation. We got the invitation. He said, yes, I'll come. So he showed up. And there he is in Ethel Payne's apartment. And he didn't just show up. He and Pat spent the whole evening there. Now, this will give you a real flavor of Washington in 1958 when she's a reporter. Here's the caption for the picture. Marking first time a vice president has socialized at the home of a Negro in Washington. Does give you a sense of the flavor. By this point, Ethel Payne had become iconic. She was known to African Americans as this extraordinary crusading reporter. The headlines often had things like Ethel sees hate, Payne lands in India, Ethel's exclusive. It was very much a personal form of journalism. She began to be known by presidents like John F. Kennedy, LBJ. There he is using a brand new high-tech device to the far right, the teleprompter, as they called it back then. Here he is giving her a pen from the '64 Civil Rights Act signing. He also gave her one pen from the '65 Voting Rights Act signing. She ended up going to Vietnam in '67. I won't tell you because we're running out of time, the story behind that, except you'll love this headline. Daily Defender to have its own man in Vietnam, but she's a girl. So even at 67, she's struggling against these kinds of things. Extensive coverage of what was going on, but essentially using her iconic position of being so well known. Her favorite seat was no longer in the newsroom, but was on the back of an airplane. She went to China, the first group of reporters to go there from the United States after it was opened. And if you look at the people on the street in Shanghai, they're looking at her thinking, who the heck is she? And with the leopard skin, the reporters traveling with her decided that they thought she was a ruler from Africa. So the reporters got out of the car, and as she went by, they went like this. And Ethel Payne, when she got in the car, was just crying with tears of laughter. I love showing this picture because if you see there's the only other woman in the group is over there. That is Susan Sontag. And if you look at her body expression, she clearly thinks, I'm not part of this group. She ended up knowing everybody, Shirley Chisholm, Jimmy Carter, there she's Jesse Jackson in 1984. And then in 1990, a year before her death, she went to South Africa to interview Nelson Mandela after he'd gotten released. And to show you her sense of humbleness, on the back of the photograph she inscribed that lots of people got to interview Nelson Mandela. I'm the only one who did so while he was in his PJs. She's constantly referred to at this point as the First Lady of the Black Press, but she's failing to be known by a lot of younger generation people. She goes to a Black Caucus dinner and the security guards ask her to leave because they don't know who she is. And now, years after her death, the United States publishes a postage stamp honoring her. And when I started this book, there were 4 postage stamps for honoring 4 female journalists. 3 of them were white, the 4th one was African American, and you know the story. The only one who had yet to have a biography written about him was Ethel Payne. So I want to close on something that I think to me is really spooky because it says a lot about what we've seen happen this fall in the United States. When she died, James A. Joseph was asked to give her eulogy at her funeral. And what he said about her, to my mind, is something that the United States should hear over and over again. It applies to journalism. She used her skills not to acquire power for herself, but to activate power in others. This is in 1991. At a time in which our world seems to be fragmented into we and they groups, Ethel was searching for the social glue of civil society, affirming the connectiveness of humanity. She made the case in all sectors of our society that the fear of difference is a fear of the future. In her own work, she was not simply reporting the news, he said. She was stretching the horizon of the heart, widening the circle of community, seeking to transform the laissez-faire notion of live and let live into a moral imperative of live and help live. And I would say we could do with a large dose of that today. That's Ethel Payne's short version of the story. If you want to read all 400 pages, it's out there. Thank you. You've been wonderful.